Hi, I think we just wait for everyone, just to give everyone a moment just to log in. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Delighted to have over 400 attendees to this webinar. This is obviously the benefits of Zoom on a wet, cold, windy morning, certainly where I am anyway. So the webinar this morning, we're going to give you an overview of our latest findings on renewable hydrogen. And this is work that's been kicked off. It was driven out of the Offshore Wind Sector Deal that we did last year, March 2019. We've got a great lineup for you this morning. David Wallace from OWIC. We have Barnaby Wharton from RenewableUK, Graham Cooley from ITM, and Rita Wadey from BAYS. We'll make time for questions at the end, as you can see from the agenda. We'll take the questions. Can you use the Q&A function to we'll take the questions and moderate through that. There's too many people to have individual questions. I think that would be tricky. And finally, please feel free to tweet via the hashtag #IntegrationChallenge20 handle. And with that, I'll hand over to David. Before I hand over to David, please note the session is being recorded. And David, can I please hand over to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Jane. So I'm going to just briefly walk through the highlights that came out of the study that we did with OWIC over about the last 9 months or so. And what we were looking at was the prospects, what needs to be done to have green hydrogen from offshore wind be part of the solution, a major part of the solution potentially for 2050 decarbonisation targets. And our role in the project at Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult was really to take the expertise and our approach to looking at offshore wind, cost reduction, the learning rates for that, and apply that, extend that approach and that modelling to green hydrogen production using electrolysis. So I'll walk through some of the highlights of that. Next slide, please. So first of all, we wanted to really nail the question of how much offshore wind, because with hydrogen now you are potentially able to access all of heating, all of transport markets, not just immediate electricity consumption. But on the supply side of that, realistically, how much affordable offshore wind, renewable resource do you have potentially to make green hydrogen? So we revisited some modelling we'd done earlier and that some others had done that really goes back to the early days of offshore winds, where people were looking at the total resource. We know so much more now about what the actual costs are and will be out to 2050. And so we've shown, and it's set out in the report, that the resource is very large. It's easily able to supply at affordable levels all of the UK's energy needs, with plenty of surplus to supply into a global market, to supply offshore wind sourced energy, green hydrogen, for Europe's needs, for wider global needs as a global green hydrogen market evolves. Next slide, please. So the report is available online, and I'm sure links will be available with materials from the webinar, either from our website or from Offshore Wind Industry Council. And let me just move something here. Yeah. In running through the key findings, we wanted to, first of all, address what is the potential size, the potential role for green hydrogen in integrating a whole energy system, where you have a large amount of offshore renewables, and we took the 75 gigawatt level that the Offshore Wind Sector Deal is talking about for 2050, and reviewing other people's work, doing a little bit of our own work. It's clear that there's a sweet spot of at least 130, 200 terawatt hours of green hydrogen, of hydrogen requirement for integrating offshore wind, therefore green hydrogen, in a range of different models, different scenarios, where modelers are looking at the whole energy system. And we used that demand, and we also surveyed global demand estimates for electrolysis, which are suggesting up to 4,000 gigawatts of deployment of electrolysis, to really break down what is the cost reduction journey going to be for electrolysis, and therefore for offshore wind, and also taking our knowledge from the offshore wind sector. What is the cost reduction going to be in input electricity cost? Therefore, coming out with this levelized cost of hydrogen projection. And in that projection, and I would say that in the Catapult, we've always been fairly conservative in the way we've estimated offshore wind cost projections. We were fairly conservative again in our estimates for the scale up of electrolysis, and therefore the cost reduction. So taking a fairly conservative approach, we see green hydrogen in scenarios with either offshore hydrogen being produced at offshore wind farms, or hydrogen being produced onshore but sourced from offshore wind farms, with PEM technology for electrolysis producing green hydrogen. We see the green hydrogen being lower cost than blue hydrogen by 2050, and we also did cost reduction estimates for SMR and ATR, the two main proposed ways of producing blue hydrogen. Next slide, please, Vicky. So, as I said, we're fairly conservative. We, even during the project, I think many of you will be aware of just how fast this space is moving. It was moving too fast for us to keep up with this sort of project, with this sort of level of detailed modelling. You have to freeze some assumptions at some point. We've seen, I'm sure others have seen, I think some of the other panels will talk about this, the market, the policies have been setting out likely deployment of electrolysis, green hydrogen going much faster than what our assumptions were, and our assumptions, as I said, were driving that cost reduction journey. So that's certainly something to look out for, and we're very keen to have another go around with our model with updated scenarios from others. But that, whatever that speed of uptake of deployment of electrolyzers is, that's the key for driving the cost reduction. That's what the learning rate is based on. It's not something that happens automatically over time. It only happens if you drive the reduction. And that also helps to drive the technology acceleration. And what we did was we were able to pick out the main components within the black box of the electrolyzer and say how much each of those can contribute to a cost reduction journey. So with all that, what we're really keen to do in the report is get to that final view of what does this all mean for the UK economy? What is the potential for this? Given that, as we'll hear later on, we're in a very good position in academia with the knowledge base that we have there around green hydrogen, electrolysis and fuel cells and so on, but also the position that we are in with some of our leading technologies and companies in the UK. We looked at two things, not just the potential for that electrolyser market and exports for UK producers, manufacturers, but also in that 2050 picture, how much additional offshore winds have we been able to unlock through having green hydrogen, through having affordable green hydrogen production. So we looked at the economic potential, the jobs and the gross value added to the economy of both of those sources. As you see there in the high estimates, in our summary of key findings, we just highlighted the high estimates, but the full details of all that are in the report. From electrolysers and offshore wind total, there's up to, we see 320 billion of cumulative GVA, of which, as we've emphasised here, 250 billion we see as potentially being exports from the UK, primarily of electrolysers, with some of that coming from additional exports from the offshore wind sector directly. This sustains up to 120,000 additional jobs, so 120,000 new positions continuously sustained by 2050. Much of that outside of London and South East because of where we expect manufacturing to be of electrolysers, and also because of where the offshore wind supply chain, where the value of that is located around the UK and coastal areas. We also looked into some of that potential for exports of the surplus energy that we can be providing from offshore wind through green hydrogen, and that could be up to £48 billion per year, which is comparable to the best years of what the oil and gas sector has contributed to the UK economy. So there's potential to replace that as that inevitably has to drop away. And we also set out briefly just some of the beneficiaries in the supply chain, but I think Graham Cooley may say a lot more about that later. Could have next slide, please, Vicky. As I said, we were able to identify in some detail what are those key components within the electrolyser black box, and what are the performance features of electrolysers that allow us to set out a programme for research across universities and catapults and industry to target where we have the greatest opportunity for cost reduction on the electrolysis side. So we set out here some of the main features, and as I said, we also set out the breakdown of potential contribution to cost reduction from balance of plant, the power electronics, the membranes themselves in the stack, and so on. And details of that are in the report. Next slide, please. Again, driving that deployment, really ramping up the deployment is key to getting down the cost curve, just as we've seen with offshore wind, just as we've seen with solar PV globally. It's very important now to identify near-term where are the best opportunities for starting to create that market within the UK for green hydrogen. We set out what we think are some of the good prospects for that. And this is kind of pick and mix, if you like, but at some level, we need to be keeping an eye on, as an industry at government level, we need to be keeping an eye on what does this all add up to in terms of scale, in terms of scale of electrolyser deployment and hydrogen demand, green hydrogen demand. So some of the options for getting to that scale near term are demonstration projects specifically for demonstrating offshore wind and green hydrogen integration. Many opportunities across mobility where green hydrogen can become competitive, perhaps the quickest in many cases. In the gas network itself, there are enabling demonstrations that are very critical that need to happen in the near term. In industry, there will be opportunities as industry is tackling the need to decarbonize its use of hydrogen, which is quite large at the moment. There will be opportunities there. And because there's already quite a large hydrogen ecosystem and infrastructure around industrial clusters, those are good locations for building up demonstration projects, for bringing in residential and commercial and transportation demonstrations around those clusters. Next slide, please. And then the third thing we looked at in terms of what needs to be on that pathway for deploying green hydrogen was a range of enabling conditions across policies and regulations. I won't pick out any of these in particular, other than to say there's a very important element of coordination with what's happening across Europe and what will be happening across Europe, both in terms of infrastructure and rollout of things like energy islands and integration of hydrogen production with offshore wind and with grid infrastructure, potentially offshore. And also integration and coordination with the policies at European level and in individual countries, because what we see is that there's enormous potential for us to help reduce the cost of decarbonisation in European countries which don't have the kind of renewable resource that we do from offshore wind. I know that some of the other speakers are going to pick up more on some of the policy points, so I'll leave it there and hand it back to Jane. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and you're absolutely right on time. That's very impressive. I realised after I handed over to you, I didn't actually introduce myself. My name is Jane Cooper, and I look after stakeholder and regulations for Ørsted in the UK. And I was the delivery team lead on this particular report delivery, working with David over Catapult and working with the Offshore Wind Industry Council to make sure we're able to bring it forward in a timely manner. So please feel free to send through your Q&A questions. There's a couple coming through, and if there's any chat, I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll go through them at the end. So thank you, David, and over to you, Barnaby.
Good morning, and thank you very much, everybody. So for those that don't know me, my name is Barnaby Wharton. I am Director of Future Electricity Systems at RenewableUK. I'm sure you're familiar with RenewableUK, but we are the trade association in the energy sector, and our members are building the sort of the future low carbon energy system. And we published last week our report on renewable hydrogen, seizing the UK opportunity. And really the main message that I want you all to take away is that the UK has a huge opportunity right now. This is about to become, I think, a very large global industry, and we have all of the ingredients to make the most of it and bring a lot of benefits to the UK. And my approach to this has really been to think about it. Hydrogen has been around for a long time. It's not a brand new thing. We've been doing it for, I think, over 100 years now. And so I thought, okay, are there other sectors, other sort of technologies we can look at that have been around for a long time, but we've just really grasped and really made a difference quite recently. And the obvious one, if we go to the next slide, please, is the wind sector. Oh, is the slide clicking on? Great. And the wind sector has been through a huge amount of change over the past couple of decades. And I think there are a huge number of lessons to be learned. The big question is about cost. And renewable hydrogen is currently relatively expensive, but only 20 years ago, the prices for offshore wind today were being forecast at around well over £150 a megawatt hour. And we have seen that cost drop hugely. And 2012, the offshore wind industry said we're going to be contracting projects in 2020 at £100. That was the target. And as you all know, last year we had CFD auctions coming in at well under £50. So we've seen huge cost reductions. And what has driven that? And the main things that I think have been driven is, firstly, really clear commitments from government, very clear market frameworks, and it's sort of just endorsement and a plan and a strategy across business and government to deliver this. And we've seen that being continued in the industrial strategy, and that's going to continue to grow the offshore wind sector, and that's going to be critical for hydrogen in the future as well. What we've also learned from wind is about innovation and how rapidly things can change, again, if the sector is and government are committed to it. Only 10 years ago, the idea that you'd have a 10 megawatt turbine was astonishing. And now we're talking about 20 megawatt turbines that are going to be 300 meters tall. And obviously floating as well is becoming really important and a really interesting picture in the offshore wind sector, which again is going to be really important for hydrogen in the future. And the next lesson I think we want to take away from the offshore wind sector is by supporting the deployment of offshore wind, we've really supported the supply chain in the UK. And we have got thousands of jobs across the UK in the offshore wind sector, supporting what is a world-leading industry here. And again, that's something we, I think, can do in the UK with hydrogen. Because we already have a world-leading supply chain, and I'm going to hear more from Graham a bit later on about that. So those are the key ingredients, and I think there's so much we can learn from offshore wind. So just to then roll on to a bit, why hydrogen? Can we flip on to the next slide? There's a lot of hype about hydrogen right now, and I think quite rightly. We need to decarbonise the UK. We, as you all are well aware, we've got our 2050 targets. We've done a great job in power, but we are really lagging behind in pretty much every other sector. Chart on the left, you can see that industry has fallen, but that is as much by industry has decarbonised, but also we have offshored a lot. But the other sectors are kind of flatlining. So we need to decarbonise them. Electrification is going to go a long way in heat, in surface transport, I think in particular. But what hydrogen can do is link the generation of renewable electricity and the huge resources we have, particularly with offshore wind, but also onshore solar, and actually wave and tidal as well. It can link the electricity sector with the sort of the molecules and I guess sort of the gas sector, as it were. So we can really take a whole system approach, and those things like sort of industrial heat, which needs to have really gas for the intensity of the heat, and as well as industrial processes. And you can take things like marine and long distance freight, which I think is going to be hydrogen over batteries, but there's a huge debate about that. But we can link those up, and that's why hydrogen is going to be so important, and renewable hydrogen in particular, because we can be truly zero carbon. The other thing that hydrogen can do is become a really great partner with wind, and there's a lot of detail in the report from the Catapult on this, and if you haven't read it, do. It's a great report. But obviously wind is variable in its generation, and what hydrogen will enable is to take the excess electricity that we have from wind. When the grid doesn't demand the electricity, we can put that into hydrogen. We can build out much more renewable generation and link it directly to hydrogen production, and bring much more flexibility to the system that will help decarbonize electricity. And it does that with long-term storage. The chart on the right here is the past 12 months of wind generation, and you can see that it is very variable, both sort of very short term, this is weekly averages, and over the year. And we're just about to have Storm, Alex, Andre, Andy, whatever, coming through. Going to be lots of wind generation. We shouldn't be wasting that wind generation. And hydrogen can provide a way to capture all of that renewable power. So, from a decarbonisation point of view, from a system balancing point of view, there is this massive opportunity that will reduce costs, reduce emissions, and that's all very positive. But I think as well as that sort of system benefits, there's also the economic benefit. Can we click on to the next slide, please? David's already touched on this as well, but there is going to be a huge market for hydrogen in the future. One estimate, $2.5 trillion by 2050. That's a massive market. The UK has got fantastic resources to produce renewable hydrogen and capture some of that market. So we really mustn't lose out on that. Alongside that, there are many jobs to be had. Again, the Catapult, and David mentioned this, 120,000 jobs across the sort of green hydrogen and offshore wind economy. And with it comes all the necessary skills. And that's going to create revenue and value for the UK. And the other thing to be really aware of is the UK is really well placed in terms of academic and research institutions. We're really good at this stuff in terms of just the research and knowledge that we have in the UK. And we obviously have some of the world leading manufacturers as well. So very briefly, how do we deliver on all of this? Next slide, please. So our paper makes 5 recommendations. Firstly, hydrogen strategy. We really want the government to set out kind of what we're going to do with hydrogen and why. That will enable business to understand the direction of travel. It'll support investment and sort of kickstart that economy. We need a plan for the first gigawatt of capacity. What are actually going to be the projects, the demonstrators that are going to start this economy off. That'll kickstart the supply chain, it'll drive investment, it'll drive excitement, and it'll support a really diverse range of business models, because there's loads of different things we could do in this sector. Some will work, some won't, but we need to try them all out and see which do work. Once we've got that first gigawatt, let's have a plan for the first 5, the first 10 and more over the next 10, 15 years, and link that to a cost reduction target. And I think the experience from every other aspect of the low carbon energy sector has been that cost targets are smashed. We saw it in wind, we've seen it in batteries, we've seen it in solar. So let's repeat that and learn lessons of the past. That can be delivered by a market mechanism. We've seen again with CFD or similar, it reduces risks for projects, it brings in capital, it brings in low cost capital. And once you've really got that economy and that industry moving, you can then move to a market model. And finally, none of this is going to work without a demand side policy as well. We need to know where this hydrogen is going to go. Long distance freight industry. Let's get some of those demonstrators going as well. The Gigastack project with Ørsted and ITM, who are here today, and Phillips 99, looking at the role of hydrogen in it is refining, I think, is going to be critical. Let's try those things out. So that's a quick run through of our paper. There is a massive opportunity for the UK here right now, and yeah, really looking forward to hearing from Graham and Rita. And yeah, happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Barney. Also, right on time. We've that's great. I would just say it's Phillips 66, not Phillips 699. Just to be clear. Thank you. And can I hand over now to Graham Cooley, CEO at ITM Power?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I'm the CEO of ITM Power. We're an electrolyser manufacturer in Sheffield. And I'm going to talk you through this from an industry and production point of view. So next slide, please. So look, I just wanted to talk to you about why hydrogen and why now. I think both David and Barnaby have touched upon this, but just from our point of view, the acceleration in the market has been incredibly rapid over the last year or even 6 months. What's the reason for that? Well, first of all, the falling cost of renewable power and the increase in volume of renewable power has done two things. It's reduced the cost of green hydrogen, and the cost of green hydrogen is dominated by the cost of the renewable energy. And of course, the volume increase as the cost of renewable power comes down means that there's a larger requirement for energy storage and for grid balancing. And the importance of that and the use of electrolysers for that is increasing. And also, policy has been very important. We're no longer looking at 80% decarbonisation in the way that we were a number of years ago. We're now looking at net zero. And of course, green hydrogen is the only net zero energy gas. And so consequently, its importance for those two reasons, cost and also policy, means it's become very, very important. And the result of that, and the result of some a very large funding packages, has meant that the industrial interest has very rapidly increased. The largest package that's been announced is from the EU, and all of these packages are green hydrogen packages. They're not blue hydrogen packages. It's green hydrogen. 140 billion from the EU over the next decade. 40 billion euros for capital equipment and 100 billion euros over the next decade, 10 billion a year for contracts for difference auctions to fund the commercial model for the development of green hydrogen. We also have a target in the EU for 6 gigawatts by 2024. That's in 4 years. So a very important target, because it's not a 2030 target or a 2050 target, it's tangible projects over the next 4 years. And to 2030, there's a target of 40 gigawatts. In Germany, Holland, Portugal and France, all of their electrolyser targets have been announced. 5 gigawatts in Germany, 3 to 4 gigawatts in Holland, Portugal 2 gigawatts. And only a couple of weeks ago, the announcement in France of 6.5 gigawatts. This is electrolyser targets for capacity over the next 10 years. Why ITM Power then? Well, we're a UK manufacturer. We're moving in November to the world's largest electrolyser factory with a capacity of 1 gigawatt per annum. And we have some very strong partners. And I'm going to tell you more about our partnership, particularly with Ørsted. So next slide, please. In terms of the commercial rationale for hydrogen, look, one of the key things about hydrogen is energy storage. And I think Barnaby touched upon this earlier. I spent many years in the power industry looking at energy storage. And what we tried to do was store electrons. And actually, electrons are very, very difficult to store. Actually, the easiest way of storing renewable energy is to turn those electrons into molecules. We know how to store molecules. We've been doing it for 100 years. And so what you now have is the possibility of storing renewable energy and applying it to some of those industries that would be difficult to decarbonize without molecules, like the gas grid, like transport, and like the massive existing market of renewable chemistry. The size of the gas grid, 800 terawatt hours flowing through the gas grid in the UK. We use 700 terawatt hours of fuel. And in Europe, the existing market for hydrogen is already 400 terawatt hours. So in the chemistry industry, we're not looking at a new market. This is an existing market that needs decarbonizing. The other point about hydrogen is it gives renewable energy companies a new product. So today, a renewable energy company, its product is green electrons. Gives the possibility of a product, green hydrogen, and the possibility of arbitraging between those two products. And just to give you an idea of market size, refining alone, if you were to decarbonize 10% of the hydrogen at refineries, that's 90 billion euros worth of electrolysis equipment. And I think Barnaby gave a global figure for electrolysis at $2.5 trillion. So these are, we're talking about massive markets, and therefore a massive opportunity for the UK to manufacture equipment and to export worldwide. Next slide. So one of our largest projects is the projects in Humberside, green hydrogen for Humber. We work very closely with Linde, and that's ITM Linde Electrolysis, with Ørsted and Phillips 66. Why Humberside, first of all? Humberside is the most carbonising industrial cluster in the UK. It also happens to have the main substation for landing the offshore wind from Hornsea 1 and Hornsea 2, respectively 1.2 and 1.4 gigawatts. And Hornsea 1 today is the world's largest offshore wind farm. So it's a fantastic demonstration of the use of green hydrogen. We couple 100 megawatts, and it's a front-end engineering design right now, but we're coupling 100 megawatts to the 1.4 gigawatts of Hornsea 2, producing green hydrogen with a pipe that goes over the fence directly into the refinery at P66. So it's on-site production of green hydrogen to decarbonize the refinery. Next slide. So in terms of manufacturing, this is our factory in Sheffield. It's Bessemer Park. It's just off the M1. You can see it from traveling northbound or southbound on the M1. It's 134,000 square feet. As I said earlier, we move the manufacturing equipment in November. I moved into my office as the first employee to move in a couple of weeks ago, and it has a 5 megawatt test bay, fully ATEX rated test bay, 5 megawatt power supply, and a capacity of 1,000 megawatts or 1 gigawatt per annum. And it's the world's largest electrolyzer factory. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to end with what we need in the UK in terms of energy policy, so that we can scale green hydrogen, reduce the costs, and get to the point where green hydrogen is a replacement as soon as possible for methane. And if you look at energy gases, of course, methane is the largest energy vector on the planet. We're also interested in replacing petrol and diesel in transport. And I think we are looking to the government to have a focus on green hydrogen in the way that the EU and other EU countries are focusing on green hydrogen. And I think that's important because, of course, we have the richest wind resource across most of the world in the UK. It's an astonishing opportunity. And we need to incentivize volume so that we can reduce costs. Specific asks would be that in transport, there's a workable RTFO. RTFO is the Renewable Transport Fuels Obligation. And today, for hydrogen, it's very difficult to access. Power to gas energy storage, we are looking for a level playing field with biomethane. Today, there's a tariff structure for putting biomethane into the gas grid. There's no green hydrogen tariff structure for gas grid injection right now. And third, there needs to be a very large scheme for fuel switching for industry, so the industry can move from coal and gas and grey hydrogen to green hydrogen. So they would be my policy asks. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you. And now we're going to hand over to Rita Wadey, Deputy Director of Hydrogen at BEIS. Rita.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you very much for the invite to speak today. If we can move on to the next slide, Vicky. This just shows in brief the kinds of things that I'm going to cover today. Moving on to the next slide. UK context. So we've heard a lot from other speakers about the UK context and why hydrogen makes sense, but just to give you the government position on that, you know, the UK set a benchmark for by legislating for net zero, and we see that hydrogen is critical it's a handful of critical technologies that are necessary for really deep decarbonisation, and that was supported by the Committee on Climate Change, who from November 18 in their hydrogen report said that it was an important tool to be used selectively in the energy system, and then by the time they published the net zero report said that moving from 80 to 100%, as Graham has said, leaves nowhere to hide and makes hydrogen an essential part of the strategy. I'd like to say how much I welcome the report on solving the integration challenge. When the sector deal was in development, me and other colleagues in BEIS were keen to see that hydrogen was included, and to go from just 4 brief mentions in that document to the publication of this report and RenewableUK's recent statements is important and timely, as we're seeing the interest in the role of green hydrogen in meeting net zero and Paris commitments increasing, as Graham's been setting out. It's a really important addition to understanding of the potential of offshore wind and hydrogen in the UK context, and to the evidence base that is we are developing and gathering to support the UK strategic approach. You know, as David said up front, it's a very fast-moving area, and we too are having to update our own assumptions and scenarios, as are the CCC, on the role of hydrogen. We can't know what that's going to be exactly in the future, but we do know that it reduces the system cost of meeting net zero in nearly all scenarios, and we know that the UK has a near unique position in terms of geography and geology and our ability to produce hydrogen from renewable sources, but also produce CCUS-enabled hydrogen, which I'll come on to a little later. And also the nature of our energy system at the moment means that we've got a lot of good use cases for hydrogen in a variety of end-use sectors in the way that perhaps some other countries do not. So it allows us to have the potential to develop a market in supply and demand that is valuable for the UK, but also potentially useful for exports, as these reports have set out. We need action in the 2020s to provide assurance and drive down costs and secure investment and capture economic benefits. And I think we're clear that it's not an either-or discussion with electrification. It's about hydrogen being a complement and an enabler to a deeply renewable energy system. And as others have said, that capacity for a decarbonised gas in the system at scale that can provide the storability and flexibility that methane does in our current system will be highly valuable. So on the next slide, I'm pleased to say that just last month, our Secretary of State, Alex Sharma, committed publicly to the publication of a UK hydrogen strategy in early 21, which is very useful for us because I can stop using some of my code around that, because development is well underway and our thinking is well underway, and we're working very closely with Minister Kwarteng on that. At the moment, we're developing content and thinking about how we might want to cut this, but I just wanted to lay out some of the things that we expect it to cover. So we do want it to make the case for hydrogen in the UK context and set out a vision. It will take a whole system view, thinking about supply all the way through to demand. As I've said, it will focus on action required in the 2020s to get things moving. As other speakers have said, that is a really important thing. But it will talk about how we need to lay the ground for any ramp up beyond 2030. We want to talk about how we capture the economic benefits for the UK, and others have referred to this morning. Supply chain, jobs and skills, export opportunities, how we can learn the lessons from other sectors. Barnaby talked about the offshore wind sector and what we can learn from that. What we can learn from the oil and gas sector as well. There's a lot of talk about the potential for the oil and gas sector to evolve into supporting CCUS and hydrogen. How do we go about doing that and maintain some of that economic benefit that those activities have brought to the UK? I know that my team have met with David and his colleagues and agreed to have a follow-up meeting on lessons learned from offshore wind in building the UK supply chain, and how we might factor that into our approach, and that's an area that we're very alive to at the moment. We also want the strategy to be an opportunity to bring together and showcase UK hydrogen, and talk about some of the projects that have been highlighted today. Moving on to the next slide to talk about sequencing. The timing makes sense because of some other things that are going on in the energy landscape. I haven't put timing beforehand because these things are very fluid. You'll all be familiar with the Energy White Paper's long evolution, but that is still very much a priority for the Secretary of State and Minister Kwarteng. There'll be other things coming up ahead of that, the spending review, CCC advice on Carbon Budget 6, and then sectoral strategies are going to be important, the heat and building strategy and the transport decarbonisation plan. And we'll want to pull all of that, and those strategies will talk about the rightful place for hydrogen in meeting that sector's ambitions for decarbonisation, and we can bring all of that together in a hydrogen strategy. Our colleagues in industrial energy are also publishing an industrial decarbonisation strategy, and we'll draw from that. What we want to do alongside the strategy, and we're working now on thinking about what revenue support is necessary for hydrogen and what preferred business models might be to support hydrogen production and end use. And we consulted at a very high level last year on this subject, and that was part of the CCUS review of delivery and investment frameworks. But it was about hydrogen, so it was about CCUS-enabled hydrogen, and it was about green hydrogen. And going forward, our work is looking at both of those forms of production. And alongside, we'll be updating further on activity in that space at the end of this year. But alongside the hydrogen strategy, our plan is to publish a minded to consultation on a preferred business model support for hydrogen, and we think that will be really important. Moving on to the next slide on production. So I know that the report talks about the potential for green in 2050, but that there is a role for blue in the meantime as a transition fuel. We are very much committed to a twin track approach, not blue or green, but both. We want to develop those in tandem. We believe that blue hydrogen is necessary for scale in the very near term, volumes that are going to drive investment across the value chain, but we also want to nurture and scale up our renewable hydrogen capability, because we know that capability on the pathway, that green hydrogen on the pathway to net zero is where we want to be. And I note that Graham's pointed out that many of the European strategies focus on green hydrogen, and that is true. But Germany, for example, does talk about the role that blue hydrogen is going to play in its own hydrogen transition, but that it will import that. We know that the Netherlands and Norway, because of their geography, geology and experience, are also interested in blue hydrogen as well as green, and we're in a very similar position there. But our twin track approach has informed our innovation to date. It is informing our low carbon hydrogen fund development and our business model development, and will underpin our strategy development. There's a slide here on the funding landscape, which I'm not going to go into because I'm going to run out of time, but when the slides are shared afterwards, you'll be able to see this, and that just shows how in BEIS we have been supporting innovation funding across the value chain, and been really pleased to support some interesting projects like Gigastack, as Graham has mentioned, and a Dolphin project looking at floating offshore wind and hydrogen. And there are some future funding schemes that have been announced that will be supporting the scale-up of hydrogen, moving from innovation to deployment across sectors, but also on the production side. So how can we work together? We've established a Hydrogen Advisory Council co-chaired by Minister Kwarteng with Sinead Lynch from Shell. That met in July and will meet again in October. We want that to run for 2 years. That will inform strategy development, but also implementation. Its initial focus and initial membership is very much production focused, and that was something the Minister really wanted to push on hard at the beginning, but membership will be kept up under review, and we wanted to complement other groups that are already active in the hydrogen space or hydrogen related, things like the CCUS Council, things like the Jet Zero Council. On the next slide, the Hydrogen Advisory Council will be supported by work streams, and that will have a broader membership, and we've got an expression of interest live out at the moment to work closely with officials and look at things like a 2020s deployment roadmap, how we can maximise the economic benefit, R&D and innovation, standards, what would a low carbon hydrogen standard look like that can put us on a pathway to 2050, regulations, what does the regulatory environment need to look like, what are the regulatory barriers, and as I've said, business models is part of that as well. So lastly, next step slide. This slide looks very simple. I haven't, my internal slide of this is much more complicated. There's going to be a very busy few months ahead. It's an exciting time. As others have said, it's very fast moving time. So it's, we've got to try and keep pace with what's going on, but also take time to develop strategy, content, and to work closely with stakeholders, not just through the Hydrogen Advisory Council, but more broadly in strategy development. And I've put my contact details at the end and the contact details for the team, and please do get in touch if anything would be useful. Thank you. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Rita, that's great. I hope you don't regret putting all your emails at the end of the presentation. Okay, so we've had quite a few questions come through, and so we're moving to the panel session. We have about 20 minutes, and I'll act as moderator, and hopefully we'll be able to get through most, if not all of them. Okay, so David, Graham, this is probably one for you, possibly Rita. Do you think hydroelectrolysis will take place close to the offshore wind, i.e. offshore, or will there still be a need for transmission lines onshore?
Yes, can you hear me okay? I just unmuted.
Yes, we can.
There are several questions around that, whether it's onshore or offshore. There are a lot of different factors. We don't know enough. From our modelling, we saw very little cost difference, but there are things like, how much cost saving could you get from repurposing oil and gas pipelines, which we weren't able to get good costs for that, so we assumed new pipelines. That might help the case for offshore electrolysis at the wind farm. There's obviously distance from shore, but it's much more complex than that. I think it'll also depend on how we see the sort of European or global green hydrogen market, globally traded green hydrogen market evolving, and where facilities to serve that and infrastructure to serve that ends up being built out. At the moment, I'd sort of cop out and say it's likely to be a mix of onshore electrolysis and offshore electrolysis.
Yeah, perhaps I can come in there. So it's a cost question, isn't it? So it could be either onshore or offshore, depending on what the costs are. The fundamental question from an energy point of view is, do you transmit the energy by pipe or by wire? If the pipes exist, then of course that's the lowest way of doing it. So if you have an offshore oil asset that already has a pipe that can transmit hydrogen, then you'd do it by pipe, and you'd have the electrolyzer offshore. If you have a cable and the substation, then you would do it that way. There's an awful lot of modeling going on right now about doing it by pipe or by wire. I think ultimately, if you look at transmitting energy in the gas infrastructure versus the electricity infrastructure, at 75 bar, which is the European transmission network, you can transmit energy at a lower cost by pipe than you can by wire. And so that would be the logical conclusion. But I think the question is a very good one, and a lot of work is going on in that area.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, David. There's a couple of other questions which ask about transmission networks and OFTOs, and how things are going to be connected and what the regulatory framework looks like. And actually, I think from our point of view, from Ørsted, we're doing the work with Graham on ITM and Phillips 66 on Gigastack, and actually that's exactly some of the areas that we're looking at. And there's some of the barriers that we've identified already. So we're looking at that, and we'll be taking that forward. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me about it, I'd be very happy to chat with them about it. We're also going to try and tie it up. There's a question about the offshore transmission review, which has just been kicked off by BEIS and Ofgem, which Barney is something very close to Barney's heart. So I think we'll also be trying to pull these together. It's all linked. It's complex and it's all linked. It is exciting in a regulatory geeky kind of way.
Can I say something about the transmission review?
Yes, please.
I mean,
yes,
so the couple of questions come up about that. I mean, as people will be aware, BEIS has kicked off their offshore transmission network review. One of the work streams within that is looking at hybrid projects. The focus is on interconnectors because it's very much around the regulatory regime about transmission of electricity and how the transmission system works. But a part of it will need to be looking at storage and how we have storage and hydrogen within the wider picture. So yeah, we're very much pushing for this to be included in that too. And it's very complicated, but yeah, great fun for regulatory geeks, as Jane says.
Like us.
By the way, just one thing to add, your options are by pipe, by wire, or by ship, of course. And actually hydrogen presents this amazing opportunity to import and export renewable power from places that are rich in renewables and export them using liquid hydrogen or ammonia to somewhere that wants to import renewable energy. So one of the important things about Scottish renewables, for instance, is the ability to export renewables to countries like South Korea or like Japan in the form of hydrogen.
Okay, thanks, Graham. There's a question about the crossover point between distance from shore and export cable. I think that all comes into the kind of, I'm not sure there isn't a clear answer yet. I think those are some of the bits that the BEIS projects that they've kicked off, that's exactly some of those questions that people are trying to answer. And actually it's why the BEIS funding is so valuable in this area. And there's certainly looking at sandbox ideas. I think some of this comes out through the OWIC report, is about some of these areas about regulatory sandboxes to try and really get to the bottom of this. A different type of question, are there enough skilled people in the UK to support these projects? And if not, what's the solution? And I think this goes right to the heart of jobs, skills, green economy. I'm not sure who would like to, Graham, would you like to take this question? You've got experience of...
Yeah. So, the way I always approach skills, you try and employ great people who have got the right attitude to work, and then on the job you train them. And as we've expanded our business now. There's over 200 of us at ITM Power. We employ graduates, PhDs. We also employ apprentices, and we bring people from the traditional engineering industries in Sheffield into the hydrogen industry. So I think it's something that goes hand in hand with building, first of all, the demand and the level of manufacturing that we have. Divorcing training and education from actually working in the industry is not something I'm particularly keen on. I think as the industry expands, the possibility for jobs is pretty astonishing, and I think David had a great slide on that earlier.
Yeah, David, do you have anything to add to that? Certainly, there's a question which was specifically around your 120,000 job figure. Which year is it relevant to, and also what the areas that are lacking or required?
Yes, that's 120,000 new, relatively highly skilled, well-paid jobs in 2050. But you get most of that well in advance of that. I forget exactly what the ramp up looks like. And what part of that question, Jane? Sorry.
It was just really about if there was any identification of the skills that are lacking, because certainly I think we've got the oil and gas side of it. That's obviously that'll be. Well, we're seeing redundancies, but I think part of the green recovery, some of those will be skills. But I didn't know if you were able to point to some of the skills that are required through the work.
We've not looked at that in detail, but I know there certainly are people looking at that, and particularly across the gas industry.
Yeah, I mean, engineers that are compliant in working in the oil and gas industry would be great employees for the hydrogen industry.
Yeah, chemical process.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the oil and gas industry declines, which it inevitably will because of net zero targets, all of those skills are transferable.
Okay. Thank you, Graham. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to, because I think some of the questions have been answered through the further presentations. Graham, there was a specific question that came through for you. Very simple. Are the EU targets you mentioned valid given Brexit? Well, maybe that's not so simple. I should have read to the end of the question first.
No, I don't mind that, taking that question now. I mean, the answer is, will the UK be collaborative with Horizon Europe? So today we're right at the end of Horizon 2020. We have the last set of schemes for Horizon 2020, and in the deal that's being discussed right now, if it includes membership of Horizon Europe, which is what takes us beyond 2020, then yes, they will, because they're the schemes that will be administering that 140 billion euros. If we're not part of that, then the answer is no. So, this is one of the reasons with industry that if you're a competitor of, and let me be very selfish about this, if you're a European competitor of ITM Power, you will be able to access all of that funding. Okay, now we developed a joint venture with Linde, which is in Germany, and we have a German company called ITM Power GmbH. And so we from a industrial point of view, have mitigated any risk of that happening. But what the UK government does have to understand is that British companies and manufacturing in the UK would be compromised if we weren't a member of that mechanism. I think that's fair, isn't it, Rita?
Yeah, just to say, like, we recognise very much the role that the Horizon programmes have played in supporting electrolysis and fuel cells and their deployment in the UK, and the share of that funding that the UK has been the recipient of historically, and it is something that we've engaged with our colleagues internally, and that has been noted. I think at this point we're not going to get certainty on the future relationship until we get beyond the transition deal, and I think then that will really help us understand the way that we can engage with our European neighbours, because there is a lot of interest in there being future collaboration in the North Sea countries, and bilaterally and collaboratively, things like mission innovation and the clean energy ministerial, but we don't know on what terms we're going to be able to do that yet, and we don't know what the access to those funds are going to be. So I wholly recognise the uncertainty, which unfortunately will be with us a little longer.
Yeah. I would just say to the person that asked that question, the UK government have really got their head around this opportunity. I can tell you that there is a lot of work going on, and it is very different to the way it was years ago. Hydrogen is up there on the agenda and is seen as a very important element of net zero.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Do the panel, so let's take this in turn, do the panel see any good reason for persisting with blue hydrogen apart from protecting those in existing oil and gas supply chains? Let me go to Barnaby. Can I go to you first?
Sure. I mean, I think, as Rita's said, and I'm sure she will have a view on this as well. In the short term, we are producing blue hydrogen, or grey hydrogen, and we need CCS with that. That has the scope to scale up, I suppose, relatively quickly. And if we want to drive demand, that's probably where that demand will come through. Or Graham shaking his head there. But I think in the longer term, we need to be focusing on green. I guess the question is around what is the cost of investment in CCS to produce blue hydrogen over grey, and over what period? And if that's going to take, say, 10 years to develop the CCS infrastructure, will green hydrogen by that point actually be in a better place anyway? And could we spend that money now boosting green hydrogen and kind of skip the blue hydrogen bit? That's where the question is. So I guess it's kind of what is that short-term cost and driving demand versus sort of the long-term trajectory of green and how we get there. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's probably the best I'll do for now.
Okay, thank you, Barney. Could I go to you, Graham, please?
Yeah, I mean, this is about this report, and this discussion is about offshore integration of wind power. And I'm conscious that there's nobody on this call from industry that's representing blue, but I'll give you my view. First of all, I don't agree with Barney that you can deploy blue quickly. I think blue is a single scheme would cost billions. And the industry is saying it can be deployed first in around 2028. You can buy tens or hundreds of megawatts of electrolysis, link it with offshore wind, and do it almost, well, you can put the schemes together almost immediately. That's the first thing. Second thing is, from my point of view, green hydrogen is net zero. And if you want to get to net zero by 2050, you need to fund the cost reduction curve of the ultimate solution. Okay, and I do not see the point in funding a solution that ultimately will be a stranded asset. I also, and it's not net zero, not only from partial capture point of view, but also from the point of view of continuing to run a methane infrastructure, which will leak. And with blue hydrogen, you have to have a hydrogen infrastructure, a methane one, and a CO2 infrastructure. And then finally, I asked the question, who would take the liability for blue hydrogen and a CCS store? You're putting massive amount of CO2 into a depleted oil well, and somebody will have to underwrite that not leaking. And this is the reason that nuclear was never privatized back in the day of privatization, because the city wouldn't take the liabilities. You don't have any of those issues with green hydrogen. You can deploy it straight away. You can go down the cost curve. It's net zero, and you only need one infrastructure.
Thanks, Graham. David, can I go to you?
Barnaby said, and Graham said, you have this issue with the development of the technology that still needs to take place for CCS. So I like to think of it as a window of opportunity. If the energy industries are looking at what that commercial opportunity is. So the window of opportunity is being squeezed by the need to develop the CCS technologies further because we still don't have them yet, and that's likely to squeeze that window from this side. And we've seen over the last decade just a ramp up in the targets for decarbonisation. So at the moment of 2050, but if you take a decades-long investment decision in CCS, you're taking the risk that 2050 becomes 2040 or 2035, and your window of opportunity is gone. So it's being squeezed from both ends. Being squeezed by the timeline that might slip on the technology coming through. It's being squeezed by the timelines that might accelerate for the decarbonisation. It's an incredibly difficult decision to take commercially to invest in that scale of capital investment that's required.
Thanks, David. Amrita, finally, can I come to yourself? You may have answered this during your presentation, actually.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that I think I recognise the questions that need to be answered that have been raised by the various speakers here, and they are things that we are alive to, which is why we are talking about both and not one or the other, because cost is a consideration. The constraint around the availability of low-cost electricity in the near term is a consideration. On CCUS, I understand the liabilities point. That's not just a blue hydrogen point, that is for all of CCUS, and the suite of work that's going on the investment frameworks there is seeking to address that kind of thing. So they're all extremely valid questions and things that we will want to be exploring more internally. But at the moment, our view is we don't need to rule one out at this point, and other countries aren't underneath the surface ruling one or the other out in many cases. So I think this is a debate that will continue, and we can discuss it further in the strategy.
Okay, thanks. There's actually a lot of questions that have come through, but we are going to have to close. I've got one last question I'm going to pick out, which is, what is the current green hydrogen capacity in the UK? David, for you, on a positive note.
Actually, probably Graham, it'd be better for you. You've probably got a better handle on that.
So is the question, how many electrolyzers are there making hydrogen in the UK?
Yeah, current deployment.
Well, it's really, what's the potential for green hydrogen in the UK?
What's the potential?
Capacity.
Okay, well, I think David has outlined that in the report. So do you want to say what the report says, David?
Yeah. So the near term, there's when we go to larger projects, which we're starting to do, we know that the costs will be down at a level where there are already some markets for that green hydrogen. So it depends on what date you want to choose. It depends on what assumptions you want to make about the level of deployment in 2025 or 2030, whatever you want to look at. But you'll see, I think it's in chapter 5, there's that demand curve, which shows where the different markets for green hydrogen to displace other decarbonisation technologies and options, where those markets are starting to click in as the cost comes down. So you can sort of pick your point that you're interested in, and see what the potential might be.
But in the Commission for Climate Change's report, the technical part of the Commission for Climate Change report, they say that for energy storage alone in the UK, we need between 6 and 17 gigawatts. And that was a conservative amount of green hydrogen back in the day. And when I say back in the day, I mean it's a year ago now. It was not last May, and things have moved on incredibly since then. And there's much more blue hydrogen in that report than there was green hydrogen. And if you look at what Chris Stark has said since then, he's the CEO of the Commission for Climate Change, the ratio of green hydrogen to blue hydrogen is now looking more like 50-50, in which case you're looking at somewhere around 30 gigawatts in the UK. So we are moving very quickly in the way we're understanding the amount of energy storage that we will need, given the amount of excess renewables we need to get to net zero.
Yeah.
Thank you, Graham. I think
in some of our scenarios,
I think what we're doing here is I recognise it's 12:15 and we will need to close now, but I think we're doing an amazing job. Actually, we're trying to develop all this and move quickly in our Zoom world, and I think everyone is doing actually really well to kind of move this forward. My suggestion, recognising that Zoom world, that we haven't been able to answer the questions and answer the Q&As, I'm actually going to speak with Catapult and see if we can answer some of the questions through the Twitter handle, and we'll do it that way. So keep an eye on that, and then we can make sure that we'll try and pick through and answer those ones, because some of them are important and they're a bit more complex, and maybe some of them can be an individual conversation. So Barney, you had one last thing. I'm going to give you 5 seconds.
Thank you very much. Just on the very last question about current capacity of green hydrogen in the UK, RenewableUK, as of a few weeks ago now, as part of our project database, covers hydrogen electrolyzers. So RenewableUK members can go and look at that and see what the current capacity coming through is at the moment. It's tens of megawatts, I think, right now, but we're seeing what's coming through with the work that Graham and others are doing. We are looking at sort of hundreds pretty rapidly, so it's an exciting time.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you all for joining. What an amazing response. I'm actually wondering whether we should speak to Catapult, and maybe as we get further along, maybe we can come back later this year or early next year and give you a roundup of where we've got to, and keep you all up to date. We'll be sharing the slides. We'll be sharing the links to the papers. We'll put it out on wherever we put it out. And please get in contact with any of us if you've got any other questions. We'll try and answer what we can through the Twitter handle. So thank you panel. Thank you for your time. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
thank you audience, whoever you are. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.